If we can perhaps go ahead and get started. I am Mac Irvin, and I'm not the convener, but I will be the convener because I've been on the education committee about 30 or 40 years and convened once or twice in my life. We'll see if a convener walks in. Don't see one, so why don't you join me in the prayer? God our Father, we give thanks in these days as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the church for all those who have gone before us and created this wonderful space for us to worship and created a community that we all feel we belong to, and a community that supports us in birth, life, and death. We give thanks for the past and the future. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. We, as I say, I'm Mac Irvin, my wife Jan. We're doing a double tag team approach. We've both been involved in the Memorial Garden from the very beginning. Me, less so recently. Jan has been involved to the point where sometimes we'd be leaving town, and she says, well, I've got to go by the Memorial Garden. I said, you got to do what? She says, we have to pull some weeds because there's a service there in a couple of days. And she's not the only one. There are a number of people, I think all women, although there might have been one male weed puller through the years, but who have such an affection for that place and want it so much to be presented right for a family that's grieving that they get out there and pull weeds at times. This time of the year when we're thinking about the 75th anniversary of Trinity, it's interesting to note that those who were so smart and founded such a wonderful place didn't think about putting a memorial garden in from the get-go. Why didn't they do that? I think you're going to see, I'm going to show you a little bit of a history that shows you memorial gardens didn't come on the scene till well after Trinity was built. I'm going to try to set the stage. Jan knows all the details. She can answer. There's no question that you can ask that she cannot answer. But I'm going to try to set the stage for historically how churches have been involved with death. And they clearly have been since the beginning of the time, and I don't know a lot of stuff about the beginning of the time, but if you go back, for instance, those of you who traveled in Scotland and Ireland and Europe and even Asian countries, you often see a pile of rock. Now, the Scots and the Irish call it a cairn. And the history behind these cairns is that, at least that's what we're told, and the Scots and the Irish were always warriors they were mercenaries for other countries. That's how they supported themselves. In addition to farming and making whiskey, they made war and got paid for it. So many times when they'd come, they would each put a stone down. And when they returned from the war, they would each take a stone. And so the stones that were left to represent, that were left in that pile, like theoretically, this happens to be a cairn in Judea. So it shows that it stretches beyond the Celtic tradition. But so theoretically, the pile of stones that was left represented those who didn't come home and became a memorial to their life and to their death. And we've always, as a religious group, tried to remember folks who've died. For example, here's an old Celtic church. I think this is more than 500 years old. You could see not so much left of the church, but pretty loyally standing are those gravestones that each represent somebody who passed through this earth and somebody wanted to remember. Here's probably a little slightly better taken care of. I think this is in Ireland somewhere. Again, you see that the church is in the middle of a graveyard. The word graveyard from the Greek, and I'm not going to try to interpret any Greek, that's for the paid professionals, but it means sleeping place. So the church has always been involved for centuries in providing a sleeping place for its members, its families, and its friends. When we came to the United States, and again, I'm talking mainly from our tradition as a Reformed church, I happen to be Scottish background. A lot of you are Irish. Some of you may be German. I don't know as much about the German tradition, but the European traditions were brought over here. And here's a little church that still exists in Cades Cove, Tennessee, Primitive Baptist Church. And you can see one of the first things they probably did after they built their sanctuary. And I think this is now under the control of the government, probably because of the national park. But this simple little church had a graveyard for its members. Kind of hard to flip both of these. Now, here's another example of a church that came to America during one of the first small communities in Manhattan that only had, I think, 20 or 30,000 residents. Here's one of the world's most famous, and I would venture to say, most valuable cemetery in the world, at Trinity Church in Manhattan on the corner of Wall Street and Broadway. This church that now has property that's valued at $6 billion still today, spent some of their efforts in building a wonderful cemetery. That cemetery has become world famous recently. I mean, I'm sure it was always famous, but it's more famous after Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, and then the musical. Hamilton became all of a sudden a keen figure in our lives. He's always been important, but he became more important as we studied him. And I can remember when Jan and I were in New York, I said, I'm going to go see Hamilton's gravesite. And sure enough, they have tours set up. They don't only allow you to come in. I mean, literally probably 1 million people a year want to go see Hamilton's tombstone. But that's a wonderful little sanctuary and right in the middle of Manhattan, and well worth your travel if you get there. The problem with these cemeteries built in the community, as the community became more populated, is people began to get nervous that it created a health and safety factor. So there was a move, and I think this was 1830 when this developed. In Cambridge, they built the Mount Auburn Cemetery. And these cemeteries were designed to be built 1 to 5 miles outside the city limits. In other words, get these folks away from us. But it was designed to be a public park. And so these just huge cemeteries were built. We have one in Atlanta that we'll talk about. The Civil War accelerated the rate of death in the United States. There was at least 700,000 military dead and maybe more, and perhaps an equal amount of civilians that died. So we had a lot of bodies to get rid of, to put it bluntly, after that war. So more public type cemeteries. Gettysburg, a lot of you visited there, have developed. And the church sort of got out of the business of graveyards at that point. People were interested in big places that could accommodate a lot of bodies. And we had public parks built across American major cities. Atlanta was not left out of the area. You know, you probably all visited Oakland, and it was started out as a public park. They've interred, let's see how many, I was stunned by this amount. They've interred 70,000 people in Oakland. And if you want to get a spot there, you missed your chance. I don't think they have sold a spot since the 1880s. But obviously, it's as much of a park as it is a cemetery. And people visit there, people go to have lunch there and enjoy life. Here's another shot of it. You can see, obviously, if it was 1 to 5 miles outside the city at that time, somebody measured wrong, or it's just barely 1 mile estimate.
Mac, you can still buy a place at Oakland if you're lucky. You just have to
Off the side market, probably.
contact the
Not from the institution per se, I don't think.
some families no longer need
Esther says you can still buy a place. I would tell you to rush out and buy it this afternoon because yes.
Kenny Rogers was able to get, he did,
Let me try to give you the mic so folks on Zoom can hear things.
Kenny Rogers was buried recently, so.
Well, I don't want to get into the mechanics of that. It is probably true, but I bet it's on the secondary market because what I read was something like 1884. So again, that sort of doesn't matter. We have our own cemetery. We don't have to go to Oakland Park. But that was a move where the churches sort of got out of the business. Well, the churches got back in the business. For instance, here's one that's located a mile from us on Arden Road, the New Hope African Methodist AME Church. And I thought the church was no longer active. Jan just corrected me and said that she rode past there and there were cars in the parking lot yesterday or the day before. That's a little cemetery that is now sort of protected by the Buckhead Heritage Group. And that's what's happened to a lot of these church cemeteries. Sometimes the churches go out of business and the cemetery remains. And so you have to have another group that stays to protect all the interests, family, et cetera. But so this is a mile from us, still a church graveyard. And then there's another in Rock Springs. Some of you, I've worshiped at Rock Springs. I used to have a friend there, and they had an annual Kirking of the Tartan event that was always really nifty. Well, they have their own graveyard, but the church is no more. It went out of business a few years ago. And fortunately, like a lot of incidents involving churches, about 6,000 or 7,000 churches a year go out of business, believe it or not. Churches are getting repurposed for different things. Like the old Abbey restaurant was a church, then it was a restaurant, then it's become a church again. So that's really a neat kind of change where you see the church going back to its original purpose. But here, Rock Springs Presbyterian Church has been repurposed as a school. And I forget the name of it. But the cemetery is doing great. It's got a lot of sponsorship from the local neighborhood, and it has its own institution designed to protect its existence. If you wonder why didn't Trinity put a memorial garden in at the beginning, after all, we started, in 49? We're at 75. Well, you can see that way back then, this doesn't go back except till 1960, probably when the church started, probably only 2 or 3% of the people were interested in cremation. It was not very popular. It obviously has become more acceptable over the years, and you can see that when we started this in the 1990s, about 17 or 18% of the people accepted cremation. Well, it's gone way up here till 25. We're up to 63%, another decade, 10 or 15% more people. So the memorial garden, I'm not saying that we knew that when we started, but it literally, cremation is an idea whose time has come, and that you can't have a memorial garden without cremation. A couple of comments about the legal process, and I'm glad that Jim Stokes came in because he might have been involved in this. When we were going to create this cemetery, there became a little bit of anguish in the neighborhood. One guy said, wait a minute, you're building a graveyard, you're going to have bodies next door to me. So we sort of did a public relations campaign. We put out flyers in all the neighborhood. We invited folks to a meeting that would be held on the porch of the church. Not many people came. There was still one neighbor who was complaining, and I went to see him and tried to tell him that we were not going to have any bodies out there, that they'd be just a little box of ashes at best. And of course, when I mentioned this to Allison Williams, that I was a little uptight about contacting this man, he said, well, for goodness sake, don't tell him that I put out a couple of dozen bodies by scattering out in that same woods. That'll really shake him up. But so really there has been a tradition at Trinity long before the garden of scattering ashes, and that's still a possibility if you want to do it now. But anyway, we had to get a special use permit from the zoning review board. And Jim, I'm not sure if you were on at that time. You'd had a conflict of interest if you were. For me, it was a pretty awkward time because it so happens, and you don't have, you as the individual can't schedule these things. But when the schedule came out, representing my neighborhood, I was opposing the rezoning of a jazz club on Peachtree right across from Piedmont Hospital. So I had to stand up and be like the neighbor who didn't want it in their backyard, which we didn't. We didn't want a jazz club that had no parking places. They'd have all flooded. So anyway, I opposed zoning to that aspect, and then about 15 or 20 minutes later, I represented Trinity in favor of the zoning. I'll tell you that both turned out great. We blocked that jazz club. That jazz club was going to be located where that big Chick-fil-A is now. So our efforts in our Brookwood Hills neighborhood sort of allowed that Chick-fil-A to come into existence and not be a jazz club. But for Trinity, it was approved. We got our memorial garden, and Jan is the one who knows a lot more about how it's going to operate. So Jan's going to tell you how the memorial garden, I guarantee you, I'll pay you $5 if you can ask a question she cannot answer.
The pressure. Right, Mac is the speaker in our family. I'm glad all of you are friends. So, and Norman has graciously released me from rehearsal to be here with you, so I appreciate that. How this all got started. In 1991, Mac taught a church school here on death and dying and became interested in the concept of a memorial garden. My cousin in Maryland had been the primary mover of one there, so we were familiar with the idea. Mac made a proposal to worship and music. At the end of the meeting, Joanna said, "Come with me." And we followed her to her office. On her desk was a letter that she had received that morning from Skippy Goodwin. Skippy had been to see her sister, I think in Michigan, where they had installed recently a garden. And she'd come back and written a letter to Joanna saying, couldn't we do the same thing here? Joanna was sold. So, in good Presbyterian fashion, we formed a committee. Mac was asked to serve as chair, and as director of lay ministry at that time, I participated representing the staff. We soon discovered there had been a previous group exploring this possibility. It was Joe Williams and Tommy Thompson and Virginia Barra, and most of you in this room, I think, are well familiar with those names. But as it was the closing years of Allison's ministry, they thought it would be appropriate to wait for the arrival of the new pastor. Esther Stokes, Bill Graves, and Skippy Goodwin filled out the committee. And with a go-ahead from the session, we got to work. Joe, Virginia, and Tommy had selected a location, and Tommy had drawn a preliminary plan. Chris Sawyer, who was clerk of session at that time, Joanna and a group from property walked the whole campus and decided that indeed Tommy had selected the correct spot. So to the right of the church facing, the right facing the church was the best place to be. And at that time, that area still consisted of some debris from the construction of the sanctuary. So we were a beautification project as well. We hired Ed Daugherty, who had designed several memorial gardens, who was Bill Daugherty's brother and Betsy. Somebody was asking about Betsy earlier, Betsy's brother-in-law. He designed several memorial gardens, including St. Philip's. He had four main aims: simplicity, longevity, progressive blooms, and to create a place of welcome and peace. We believe he achieved those aims. Ed's proposal was actually similar in design to the one Tommy Thompson had drawn, with a central oval, but the size of the oval was a concern. The committee went to the site and spread out around the proposed dimensions. It simply felt too large. We began walking toward one another until we agreed it was perfect, and that's what you will find there today. Consensus was the hallmark of the committee. The only lack of it was possibly somewhat generational in nature. Some thought the garden as a place in which reverence reigned. On the other hand, others would welcome a small concert, outdoor church school class, or the sound of children playing. I will report that the Early Learning Center has provided sweet sounds, if only as they are passing through. We talked about access. It was a steep slope. Did we have steps and a separate ramp? No one liked that idea. We wanted one way for everyone. And so we have this beautiful winding path from the sanctuary to the garden, which also created a more appealing planting design. You might have noticed the beautiful winding fence, curving railing along the walkway. We found early on that it was a magnet for skateboarders. The paint was not happy. I believe it was Paul Marston who suggested that we add these finials, which were not original to the design. I don't know whether you can see them. So that discouraged their sport, at least along the top. We wanted hardscape so that a large group could gather around the garden, up the approach, and on the sanctuary steps. An early interment filled a good portion of that space, complete with a bagpiper playing from the sanctuary porch. We wanted seating. A low brick wall and 3 benches were added to the plan. Martin Dawes, a local artist who had created liturgical art, designed the wall sculptures and the plaques to hold the nameplates. The cost was expected to run between $40,000 and $50,000. It came in at $130,000. The trust fund graciously agreed to a loan, and we launched an initial subscription drive to raise early funds. The loan has been repaid, and the garden is self-supporting. Construction began in August 1993. In November, Joanna wrote these words in a letter to the congregation, and I thought they were special, so I will share them with you. Basic to our humanity, dear friends, basic to our humanity is a strong sense of place. It is especially so for us who claim Trinity Presbyterian Church as our spiritual home. The dignified beauty of our buildings and grounds has kept us ever mindful of that which matters in this life and in the life to come. Now Trinity will have a memorial garden in which ash remains may be interred, available to Trinity members and their families. This lovely, inviting garden will be a place for life to come full circle beneath the shadow of the cross on the Trinity steeple. Since completion, Trinity established this courtyard outside of Williams Hall, and there's now access to the garden from the sanctuary and then sweeping around to Williams Hall. The first interment was Madeline Adams on January the 29th, 1994. Interments have ranged annually from 2 to 18, the year of the Kenya airplane crash, when we lost 8 well-loved members, the Brumleys, the Loves, and Morels. The average is closer to 10. The youngest of those in the garden are newborns, the oldest 104. The application and basic information about the garden is included in this wonderful pamphlet. We have limited numbers today. They're on the piano, but they're available from the office, and as these are replaced, you'll be able to find them around the church. I would encourage all of you to pick up a copy. The main body covers information for Trinity memorial services and funerals and includes all you would need to know regarding planning. There's suggested scripture readings and music, but the best part, and what I would strongly encourage each one of you to consider, is a form that you can complete with requests for your own service and leave with the church office, where it will be filed for future reference. It does not need to reflect your final choices. It is possible to edit. And I'm sure that you can complete this in consultation with the ministry staff. In the last section, you will find, all right, this is the, we didn't take a picture of this, but this is the advanced planning form, which is near the end. And this is the application for interment, which is right at the end. So, who's eligible for inclusion? The garden was established for the use of Trinity members, present or past, and their families. In the past several weeks, Pat and John Clark and their daughter were interred here. Pat and John had moved to Tennessee, but wished to return to Trinity, a place and a community that had been such a meaningful place of their life. The application for interment is for interment, not for a particular place in the garden. To date, we have been able to find plots for families in contiguous spaces, but for that to be guaranteed, applications for those who desire to be placed together must be made by the time of the first interment. The cost is $600, which covers the cost of interment and ongoing maintenance. As an aside, we are so fortunate to have found a gardener from Oakland, Jana Roden, who has just been a godsend. It is so beautiful down there, and we don't have to worry about the weeds before every service. If you happen to run across her on the campus, please express your thanks. She is just amazing. And I believe that she's been so good that they have found other jobs for her to keep her busy, and I hope not too busy. Once the application is made, most choose their ashes to be placed within the garden, but 7 have requested to be scattered. This is since the formation of the garden in the adjoining woods. And 35 of the nameplates on the wall are memorial plaques for those who wish to be remembered at Trinity but are interred elsewhere. The garden is organized on a grid. A frequent question is, how do we know where anyone is? The garden's organized on a grid system with brass markers. Do we have that? Try it. Brass markers every yard, every square yard. And so they go from A to I, starting at the church and going across. And the numbers start in the upper corner and just come across. And so we can identify every square. A map of the grid is located in the office on which every interment is recorded, and it's also backed up on the computer. How do we get to the interment? The family may choose to have a private interment before the memorial service, and that is most common. Or they may choose to invite those who would like to join the family for the interment following the service. The garden was designed with this in mind and is my particular preference. Tom Long, who has stood in our pulpit more than once, professes this is the traditional sequence of the church. The other option is a service of interment in the garden only, which is what we had for the Clark service. Whichever choice is made, the preparation for interment is the same. Did you all see the grid? We passed it really quickly. Anyway, this is, so I don't know if you can see, these are the brass markers at each corner. And so there are 9 spaces within each set of markers. So that's how we know specifically where everybody is. Whichever choice is made, the preparation for the interment is the same. Usually, the day before the service, the ashes are transferred into a white biodegradable box provided by the church. If the family chooses the ashes to be divided, that request is honored, and we have smaller containers for that purpose. Once the ashes are transferred, they are placed on the communion table, covered with the pall, and left to rest overnight in the sanctuary. We leave them with this prayer, which may be familiar to you. Dear Lord, support us all the day long until the shadows lengthen and the evening comes, and the busy world is hushed and our work is done. And then in your great mercy, grant us safe lodging and a holy rest and peace at the last. Before interment, the minister, a member of the family, will carry the ashes from the sanctuary to the garden and place them on a small table we had made for that purpose. Following prayer and scripture, the ashes will be placed in a prepared space, and those who wish are invited to participate in what we call tucking in, a practice borrowed from Janet Davenport's church in New Canaan, Connecticut, with the trowel and the dirt that you see pictured there. Families have found this participation to be tender and meaningful. Today, All Saints' Day, we will be invited to follow the choir to the Memorial Garden at the close of worship for a short service of remembrance. You will find shepherd's hooks with names of those who have died since last November. The names correspond to the place of interment if they are in the garden, and those who are interred elsewhere are remembered as well. This year, we actually have 2 former ministers of Trinity memorialized. The center post acknowledges all those who've gone before. It's simple, lovely, and memorable, and I'm most grateful to Rebecca for her embrace of this ritual. I hope you will join us. And now, I think we have time. You are invited to a preview in our Memorial Garden, and we'll be available for questions there and also after the memorial service, following the service.
Before we do that, I don't know if we're on Zoom or not this week. Are there any questions we can answer here? Why don't you get that other mic? I'm not sure if we're on Zoom or not.
Okay. We did this a long time ago, and so I'm wondering if everything's still in order, and we paid our money, and I thought, well, maybe they, between changes of ministers and sorts of office changes, it's all in the system. Okay, well.
You have a file.
We have a file. Oh, dear. I don't want to be in it yet. Okay.
So this new church, okay, that's my question. Just tell us, what's the scoop with this new church next door?
I don't have that information, but there are people on the staff who do. And what we have done, thanks to Esther, we have the hemlock trees. From the garden, we have the hemlock trees out there. And we have planted, at the garden itself, and we have planted 2 different layers that should fill up between the ground level and the beginning of the hemlock trees. My understanding is that they are, and I have not seen their plans, that they are required to replant. Is that, Esther, do you know that? And Heather Edmondson has gotten a copy of the plans, and she is going to bulldog it, is my understanding. So it's not something we would have chosen, but I think we are better than we could have been. At one point, they were talking about building a very high columbarium that was going to be adjacent to our garden. So, and that is, my understanding is that has changed. That will not be there. Whether they're still doing one, I'm not sure, but it will not be in that place. So we're hoping for the best.
How do you know when it's full? Or then will you do like the Germans and
We
do
will.
on top?
We will.
And what about the plaques?
The plaques,
'Cause Ted said it looked like
we have
they were
talked
behind.
We have a while for our plaques, and then we are leaving that to the next generation to.
I figure the next generation is going to have some smart young entrepreneur, and they're going to do all this electronically. You won't even go to the garden. You just press a number 462, and it'll say, you know, Ned Bishop or Paul Marshall or Mac Irvin, and it'll give you our obituary and flash up a picture. It'll be a lot more modern than this.
I did not hear, and maybe it was a number, how many have been interned since 1993?
Approximately 300. So we're still in good shape. I think it's 612 spaces. Yes,
What happens after 612?
we rebury. So we are a community of saints down there. There was some discussion of, at the beginning, very beginning, of whether we wanted a columbarium. Some of the churches kind of segregate out where important people are. We were not interested in that. So we really are a community of Trinity saints down in the garden. So
The biggest decision you make in one of these is, do you go columbarium or natural? And we were all against columbarium. You know, sometimes up north you have to have it because the freezing ground and such as that. But ours was always designed to be equal to all folks, not single out anybody in particular, and I think we've maintained that. If you think we have a problem, if you've ever attended an interment service at All Saints or St. Philip's, they just have a little plot of land about as big as my tomato garden. And so they really have an issue of, you know, what's going to happen when the space runs out. We don't have that. We're really blessed to have had that location. I want to brag a little bit about our architect, I think, and our people who guided us, like Tommy Thompson and Esther and others, that we really have a great space. And unless we have a Black Plague, I'm not sure we're going to experience that.
Ruth.
I also think it's important, or at least it's important to me, the reverence that Jan gives to the ashes when she transfers them and wraps them and prepares them and takes care to do that the night before, and that the ashes are on the communion table overnight.
And I will tell you, Ruth also participates in that. So she's being very kind to me, but she also has that emotional involvement. And what has been, I think, well, I'll back up. If you had told me in 1993, when we started talking about this memorial garden, that I would ever be responsible for transfer of ashes, I would have been out the door. It just was not something that I felt that I would ever be comfortable doing. So we had a series of people who did that, and then all of a sudden they were gone, and there wasn't anybody. And I got the job. And I have found it to be extremely rewarding, because we know that the last people to have anything to do with the living remains of folks that we care deeply about are going to be done with loving care. And it's not just somebody who never knew you or cared about you. So anyway, that
I will say a plea for those of you who have the ability. I would love to see that. To me, it's a space for living. I would give anything to see a church Sunday school class down there. I don't think it's like the old days where you fear walking through a graveyard. I think it should be a room, an outdoor room for Trinity, and I'd love to see it used more often, you know, see people get their sandwiches and take them out there. And there's nothing, our view of the resurrection in our Reformed theology says nothing about disrespecting a memorial garden by being out there and doing things. So I would hope if you have a chance, schedule something out there. Bonnie.
Well, that's a That's a good idea, I think, but I'm just curious, and this might be the awful question. We're not really supposed to walk on that middle grassy area, is that right?
That's probably personal preference. I'm on there all the time. So, those are,
But
we
there's
used,
plenty of room, there's plenty of room of foundation for, say, a class of 8 or 10 kids to be out there.
well, I don't think we probably would not put chairs in the oval. We would gather around, and then we've got the walls and we've got the benches. But those, Esther, me, and those who have gone on and are interred in the garden now, who were part of our original weeding group, we had 4 groups of 2 women each week of the month who were responsible for weeding, in addition to Curtis. And I won't say we achieved perfection, but we worked really hard. And then the majority of those backs and knees gave out, and we have been really on a roller coaster trying to keep the garden looking the way we wanted it to look. And that's why finding Jana has been just an amazing gift. And I can be in California or Connecticut with the children, and I don't have to worry if there's going to be an interment because I know it's going to look right. And that has been huge. So we are close to noon. I hope you will come use our wonderful access and come to church through the garden. And I have a few minutes there, not many. And we can answer any questions you might have down there. And then please, please, please come back after. It is so meaningful. And people do come, but I don't think they understand how special it is. So I hope you will today. Thank you.